A little beggar girl saved a millionaire from a car accident. When the millionaire asked the girl what she wanted as a reward, the girl's answer made the millionaire cry desperately. The morning on the streets was just like any other for Emily. The timid sun barely warmed her skin as she walked along the dirty sidewalks of the city center. Hurrying cars zoomed past, their honks echoing like a chaotic symphony. The 8-year-old girl, with wide, curious eyes, gazed at the world with a mixture of caution and hope. Emily had the sharp gaze of someone who had learned early on to read between the lines of life. She wore faded clothes that once belonged to someone more fortunate. In her small backpack, she carried everything she owned: a piece of stale bread, a notebook filled with scribbled pages, and a faded photograph of her mother, Rebecca. She walked past a bakery, the sweet aroma of freshly baked bread lingering in the air, and paused for a moment. Her fingers brushed against the photo in her backpack as she wondered where her mother might be at that very moment. But before she could lose herself in those thoughts, a piercing sound cut through the air, the screech of tires and the roar of a frantic engine. Emily looked up and saw a truck careening out of control, speeding down a hill. People screamed and ran, but her focus locked on a black car slowly inching forward to cross the street. The driver seemed distracted, adjusting the radio or maybe checking something on his phone. A collision was inevitable. Without thinking twice, Emily shouted, "Watch out! The truck!" The car's driver looked up, startled. His eyes widened as he saw the imminent danger. He slammed on the gas and managed to swerve just in time, narrowly avoiding a direct impact. The truck barreled past, knocking over several trash cans and only coming to a stop when it crashed into a pole. Adrenaline coursed through Emily's veins, but she remained still, watching. The door of the black car opened, and a well-dressed man stepped out. He was tall, his hair perfectly styled, wearing a suit that clearly cost more than Emily could ever imagine. "Was that you? The one who shouted?" he asked, walking toward her, still catching his breath. Emily nodded silently. I could have died," the man said, placing his hands on his knees, still trying to process what had just happened. He looked at her again, this time more intently. "How can I thank you?" He pulled out his wallet and took out a few bills. "Here, please take this. It's the least I can do." Emily shook her head. "I don't want your money." The man seemed taken aback. Few people would turn down such an easy offer. He straightened up, crossing his arms. "Then what do you want?" There was a moment of silence. Emily lowered her gaze to her worn-out shoes, as if carefully considering her words. When she looked up again, her voice was quiet but firm. "I want you to help me find my mom." The man looked puzzled. "Your mom?" "Rebecca. She disappeared a long time ago. She promised she'd come back, but she never did." Emily looked directly into his eyes. "You asked what I wanted. That's it." The request hit Henry like a weight. He was a businessman used to solving problems with checks and contracts, but this request felt different. He hesitated, searching for an excuse to walk away, but something about the girl stopped him. There was sincerity in her eyes, a strength that was hard to ignore. He sighed. "I don't know how I'll do it, but I'll try." For the first time that morning, Emily smiled. It was a shy smile that lit up her face, marked by the hardships of life. Henry watched the girl as she moved to sit on a nearby curb. Despite her apparent fragility, there was a resilience about her that he couldn't overlook. He got back into his car, but didn't start it. He sat there, staring at the steering wheel, reflecting on what he had just promised. Something about that child touched him in a way he didn't understand. She hadn't asked for money, food, or clothes. All she wanted was to find someone she loved. And for the first time in a long while, Henry felt like he couldn't just walk away. Henry woke up that morning with Emily's request echoing in his mind. He wasn't entirely sure why he had agreed to help her, but the girl's sincerity had broken something inside him, something he had kept guarded for years. Before heading to the office, he did something he never imagined. He called his assistant, Lauren, and asked her to come to his house. "I need your help with something. Impersonal," he said, his tone unusually hesitant. Lauren, who was more than used to handling Henry's professional demands, was intrigued. Shortly after, she arrived at the businessman's luxurious apartment, where she found Emily sitting quietly in a corner of the living room, observing everything with curiosity, but also a hint of distrust. "Who's she?" Lauren asked, pointing at Emily. Henry sighed, as if unsure where to begin. He then briefly explained what had happened the day before. Initially skeptical, Lauren was soon convinced by the determined expression on Emily's face. "So, you want me to find this Rebecca?" Lauren asked. "Yes, and I need it done quickly," Henry replied. "Until then, Emily will stay with me." Emily's eyes widened in surprise. "I'm going to live here?" "I can't leave you on the streets," Henry said, avoiding her gaze. "At least, not until we find your mom." Lauren shook her head, impressed. "All right, I'll get started right away. But we'll need as much information from the girl as possible." While having breakfast in Henry's spacious kitchen, Emily began telling her story. She spoke about the day she was left at the shelter at just 5 years old. She remembered clearly the kiss her mother gave her on the forehead and the promise she made, "I'll come back, my love. It's just for a little while." "But she never came back," Emily said, her voice trembling. "I waited every day." Henry listened intently, something that didn't come naturally to him. Lauren jotted down notes on her tablet, mentally organizing the next steps. "What was the name of the shelter?" Lauren asked. "Hope Home," Emily replied. Lauren wrote it down and stood up. "Let's start there." Henry's black car parked in front of the modest Hope Home building. It was a stark contrast to the opulence of the city. Emily guided them to the entrance, where they were greeted by Mrs. Susan, the director. "Emily," Susan exclaimed in surprise, "what are you doing here, dear?" Emily introduced Henry and Lauren, explaining that they were searching for information about Rebecca. Susan led them to her office, a small but welcoming space filled with shelves of paperwork and a few old photos hanging on the walls. Susan opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. "Here are her records," she said, handing the folder to Lauren. Inside were a few notes and an old photo. In it, Rebecca held a young Emily in her arms. Rebecca was beautiful, with tired eyes but a loving smile. "Rebecca was a good mother," Susan remarked, "but she was always worried, as if something or someone was after her. She never told me directly, but I suspected she was running from someone." Henry exchanged a curious glance with Lauren, who immediately took notes. Later, while reviewing the documents in Henry's office, Lauren made a surprising discovery. "Wait a minute," she said, zooming in on a photo of an old employee record. "This can't be a coincidence." She showed the image to Henry. It was a domestic workers' employment form, filled out with Rebecca's name. "She worked for me?" Henry asked, astonished. "Yes, about 8 years ago," Lauren replied, "but for some reason her stay was brief. She left abruptly." Henry frowned, trying to remember. His memory couldn't retrieve any clear details about Rebecca, just a vague sense of recognition. "How is it possible that I don't remember her?" he murmured. Lauren shook her head. "Maybe you were too busy, or maybe she wanted to go unnoticed." When Emily heard about the connection between Henry and Rebecca, her eyes lit up with hope. "So you knew her? Do you think she still loves me?" The question hit Henry like a blow. He didn't know how to answer. All his life, he had avoided topics involving emotions. But in front of that child, his usual coldness didn't feel like an option. "I don't know," he finally said, "but we'll find her and ask her together." Emily smiled, confident. It was the beginning of something Henry couldn't yet name, but somehow it was already starting to change the way he saw the world. The following days were filled with an air of mystery. Henry, always used to having control over his decisions and business, felt disoriented by the recent discoveries. Emily's words echoed in his mind. "Do you think she still loves me?" It was a simple question, yet heavy with meaning he was still struggling to comprehend. Amid the search for more information, Lauren delved into old records of Henry's household staff. Among contracts and payment lists, she found notes about the period when Rebecca worked as a housekeeper. "This is odd," Lauren remarked as she analyzed the documents. According to these records, she left her job abruptly, without prior notice. "Why?" Henry asked, leaning over the desk. "The reason isn't clear, but—" Lauren pointed to a note in the corner of the record. "There are mentions of frequent visits from a man. It seems he would come to the house regularly at the end of her shifts." Henry frowned. The images in his memory were vague, but something began to take shape. Flashes of a woman in a hurry, trying to avoid contact, and a man who showed up unexpectedly at strange hours. "Do you remember anything?" Lauren asked. "It's hazy," he replied thoughtfully. "I was always busy, focused on my projects. If something was happening with her, I admit I never noticed." Lauren continued. "The shelter director mentioned that Rebecca seemed to be running from someone. This man could be the key. We need to find out who he was." Lauren's investigation eventually uncovered a name: Matthew, a former business partner of Henry, who had been ousted from the company after a scandal involving blackmail and financial manipulation. He was known for his cunning and lack of scruples. Lauren shared her findings with Henry. "It seems this Matthew not only had a troubled history with the company, but also frequented your home during the time Rebecca worked for you." Henry remained silent for a moment, absorbing the information. He remembered Matthew as a man who always sought to exploit others' weaknesses for his own benefit. "Was he threatening her?" Henry asked, more to himself than to Lauren. "We don't know for sure yet," Lauren replied. "But if he's the person I think he is, it wouldn't be surprising." That night, Henry stayed awake, replaying fragments of disjointed memories. He recalled moments when he saw Rebecca visibly tense, speaking on the phone in a corner of the garden. He also remembered a day when Matthew showed up unannounced, demanding to speak with him, but leaving after a brief conversation with Rebecca. The guilt began to weigh on him. He realized that during those years he had been almost entirely dedicated to his career, ignoring anything he deemed irrelevant. Rebecca, it seemed, had been one of those things. The next morning, Henry confided in Lauren. "I should have noticed. Something was wrong and I just didn't see it." Lauren, always professional, showed empathy. "What matters now is that we're trying to make it right. We can't change the past, but we can ensure Emily's future is different." As Lauren deepened her investigation, something unexpected happened. Matthew, who had been out of the spotlight for years, learned that his name was being mentioned again. He began discreetly monitoring Henry's actions, making moves to protect his secrets. In what seemed like a casual call, Matthew managed to speak with Henry. "Henry, it's been a while. I hear you've been digging into the past. Be careful. You know how certain stories can complicate lives." The tone was casual, but the threat was clear. Henry, trying to remain calm, replied, "If there's something you think I should know, Matthew, I'm listening." "It's not me who should worry about what you know or don't know," Matthew retorted with a laugh. "Sometimes the past is best left buried." After the call, a chill ran down Henry's spine. He knew Matthew was aware of more than he was letting on, and the implicit threat confirmed that finding Rebecca wouldn't be straightforward. By the end of the day, Lauren presented another piece of the puzzle. An old photo of Matthew and Rebecca together, taken at an event where Henry was also present. In the photo, Rebecca looked uncomfortable, while Matthew kept a possessive hand on her shoulder. "This is no coincidence," Lauren said. "He had something on her." Henry stared at the photo for a long time. For the first time, he felt that the weight of the past he had ignored could become an even heavier burden in the present, and the mystery only seemed to deepen. The days grew increasingly tense for Henry. The revelations about Rebecca and Matthew's involvement cast a shadow over his past, a past he had always deemed irrelevant. Now, however, it seemed that every loose thread from that period was intertwined with Emily's life and, perhaps, his own. One afternoon, while organizing old documents in his office, Henry came across a dusty trunk. He recognized it immediately. It was one of the few personal items he rarely opened. It contained memories of a time he avoided remembering, such as letters, photographs, and notes from years gone by. Opening the trunk, his eyes fell on a small bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The elegant handwriting on the envelope caught his attention. Rebecca. He pulled out one of the letters and began to read. The first letter expressed Rebecca's gratitude for having a job and how she admired the way Henry led his company, even if, on a personal level, he seemed distant. As he read further, the letters became more personal. Rebecca mentioned the challenges she faced outside of work, the disturbing visits from Matthew, and eventually, a secret she guarded closely. In one of the most recent letters, Rebecca wrote, "I found out I'm pregnant. I don't know how he would react if he knew. He's always so focused on work, so distant. Maybe it's better he never finds out." Henry dropped the letter, his heart racing. The words echoed in his mind. He sank heavily into his leather chair, staring at the open envelope. Could Emily be his daughter? The following hours were spent in deep reflection. Henry couldn't shake the thought that he might have been a father all along and never knew. Rebecca had made that decision for him, assuming he wouldn't be capable of handling such a responsibility. He thought about how emotionally absent he had been during that time, prioritizing his company's growth above all else. "Would I have been different?" he murmured to himself, finding no answer. The days he had spent with Emily also came to mind. Despite his initial hesitation, he felt increasingly connected to the girl. She had a sharp mind, a spark in her eyes that he was beginning to recognize. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. This possibility that Emily could be his daughter shook Henry deeply. For the first time, he began to acknowledge the emotional void he had built around himself and the impact it might have had on others. As Henry processed this new reality, Emily also noticed something different about him. He was more present, more attentive. During meals, he asked about her likes and stories, as if trying to make up for lost time. He even ventured to share small anecdotes from his own childhood, something he never did before. One evening, while watching a movie together, Emily hesitantly leaned her head against his arm. It was a shy gesture, but full of trust. Henry froze for a moment, surprised, before relaxing and wrapping his arm around her. "Do you think my mom is okay?" Emily asked softly. "I hope so," Henry replied sincerely, "and I promise we'll do everything to find her." Emily smiled, a small smile, but one filled with hope. For the first time, she felt she wasn't alone. The next day, Henry called Lauren into his office. He faced her with renewed determination. "We're not just looking for Rebecca for Emily. I need to do this for myself, too." Lauren looked at him, surprised. "For yourself?" Henry hesitated, but decided to share the letters. He showed her the passages indicating Rebecca's pregnancy, leaving Lauren stunned. "You think Emily is your daughter?" she asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if there's a chance she is, I can't ignore it anymore." Lauren nodded, recognizing the change in Henry. He was no longer the cold, calculated businessman she had worked with for years. Something about Emily, and the possibility of a shared past, was transforming him. From that moment, Henry stopped seeing Emily merely as a responsibility. She was a living connection to something he had never known he wanted: a family. As he looked at the photo of Rebecca they had found at the shelter, a new determination emerged. He would not only find Rebecca, but also do everything possible to make amends for the past, and to give Emily the love and security she deserved. The search for Rebecca had become more than just a promise to Emily. It was now a journey of redemption for Henry, a chance to reconnect with his lost humanity, and perhaps to become the father he never imagined he could be. The days of investigation revealed an uncomfortable truth. Matthew was more deeply involved in Rebecca's story than Henry had imagined. Lauren had discovered that Matthew not only intimidated Rebecca, but also seemed to know more about her whereabouts than he was willing to reveal. It was a web of manipulation and secrets, and Henry knew a confrontation was inevitable. The opportunity for that confrontation came at a corporate event. Aware that Henry was digging into the past, Matthew made a point of approaching him. They met in a discreet corner of the conference hall, away from prying eyes. "Henry, I hear you've been keeping busy," Matthew began with a cynical smile, "digging into things that are better left buried." "And what exactly do you think you know?" Henry replied, keeping his composure, though he felt his blood boil. Matthew leaned in, his tone taking on a threatening edge. "I know that girl Emily might be your daughter, and let's be honest, a story like that wouldn't do wonders for your image, would it? A millionaire businessman finding out he has a lost daughter living on the streets. Sounds like an irresistible headline." Henry narrowed his eyes. "What do you want, Matthew? Money?" "Straight to the point. That's what I like about you," Matthew replied, laughing. "Let's just say a generous contribution to my new ventures would keep my mouth shut." Henry felt the weight of Matthew's words. He was willing to destroy the fragile stability Emily had started to find in her life, just to satisfy his greed. After the encounter, Henry confided in Lauren. "He won't stop," Henry said, frustrated. "And I won't let Emily suffer because of his threats." Lauren, ever practical and efficient, devised a plan. "We need evidence," she said. "If we can record a confession or any mention of his blackmail, we can put an end to this once and for all." The following evening, Henry arranged a meeting with Matthew, pretending to consider his proposal. They met at an isolated restaurant, while Lauren, equipped with a hidden recorder, monitored everything from a distance. "Have you made up your mind?" Matthew asked in his usual casual tone. "It's a simple offer. You pay, and I disappear." Henry remained calm, encouraging Matthew to keep talking. "But why do you care so much?" Henry asked, trying to get Matthew to incriminate himself. "What really happened with Rebecca?" Matthew laughed, leaning back in his chair. "Rebecca was a fool. She thought she could escape me. She owed me, Henry. If she disappeared, it's because she knew I wouldn't let her off easy." Listening from a nearby room, Lauren pressed the button to save the recording. It was exactly what they needed. The next morning, Lauren handed the recording to a trusted lawyer of Henry's. Combined with other evidence gathered during the investigation, they built a solid case against Matthew. When Matthew received the court summons, it was clear he had lost. He tried contacting Henry again, but was ignored. His blackmail and manipulations had come to an end, and with the help of Henry's legal team, he was definitively disarmed. With Matthew out of the picture, Henry felt an enormous weight lifted from his shoulders. That evening, when he returned home, he found Emily in the living room, drawing in her notebook. She looked up at him and smiled, though there was a hint of doubt in her eyes. "Is everything okay?" she asked. Henry sat down beside her, taking a deep breath. It was time to be honest. Emily, I promised you I would never leave you, and that's a promise I intend to keep. No matter what we uncover about the past, you are important to me, and you always will be. The girl studied him, weighing his words before finally smiling. I believe you. She leaned in and hugged him, a small gesture but one full of meaning. For the first time, Henry felt that he was beginning to become the father figure Emily needed, not because it was his responsibility, but because he wanted to be there for her. It was an emotional milestone for both of them. The search for Rebecca continued, but the bond between Henry and Emily had solidified. He knew that no matter what the future held, she would never be alone again, and deep down, neither would he. Weeks of investigation finally led to a concrete lead. Lauren had located Rebecca in a small rural town far from the hustle and bustle of urban life. It was a quiet place where people lived simply and everyone knew each other's faces. Rebecca worked at a nursing home, caring for the elderly with kindness and dedication. Lauren presented the information to Henry and Emily, who reacted very differently. Is she okay? Emily asked, her eyes shining with hope. She's safe, Lauren replied, but she seems to be living a very modest life. Emily didn't hesitate. Let's go get her. Henry's black car rolled through the calm streets of the small town. Emily, sitting in the back seat, clutched the photo of her mother tightly, as if the image could shield her from the whirlwind of emotions she was feeling. Henry, at the wheel, remained silent, while Lauren tried to figure out the best approach for the reunion. They arrived at the nursing home in the afternoon. The soft voices of elderly residents and the creak of chairs in the hallways filled the air. A nurse guided them to the garden, where Rebecca was helping an older woman water some plants. When Emily saw her, her heart raced. That's her, she whispered, barely audible. Rebecca didn't notice them at first. She was focused on her task until she looked up and saw Emily standing there with Henry beside her. She froze, the watering can slipping from her hands. For a moment, everything seemed to fall silent. Emily, Rebecca said, her voice trembling. The girl ran to her, arms open, tears streaming down both of their faces. The embrace they shared was tight and filled with years of longing. Rebecca kissed her daughter's hair, murmuring a mix of apologies and declarations of love. I waited so long for you, Emily sobbed. I never stopped thinking about you, my little one, Rebecca replied. After the initial reunion, the three sat on a bench under the shade of a tree. Rebecca held Emily's hands as if afraid of losing her again. Henry stood nearby, giving them space to share the moment. Why did you leave me? Emily asked, her voice still heavy with emotion. You promised you'd come back. Rebecca closed her eyes and took a deep breath. I did it to protect you. Matthew was a dangerous man. He threatened me, said he'd hurt you if I didn't do what he wanted. I thought leaving you at the shelter would keep you safe. Emily stared at her mother, still hurt. You could have come back. You could have tried to find me. I wanted to. Every day, Emily, but I was afraid he'd find me and hurt you. Rebecca's words were sincere, and Emily could feel it, even if the pain didn't disappear immediately. While Emily walked through the garden with Lauren, Rebecca and Henry were left alone. It was an inevitable moment, filled with tension and unspoken words. You owe me a lot of explanations, Henry began, crossing his arms. How could you hide something this big? How could you never tell me about Emily? Rebecca sighed, looking at the ground. You were a busy man, Henry. Always distant, always prioritizing work. I was afraid you wouldn't care. You never gave me the chance to care, he retorted, his voice thick with frustration. I'm not proud of it, Rebecca admitted, meeting his eyes. But at the time, it felt right. I convinced myself I was protecting you too. There was a long silence before Henry finally said, I'm sorry for not noticing earlier, for being so blind. But I'm here now, and I want to be part of this. Rebecca nodded, emotional. "You're here, and that's what matters." Yet when they returned to the bench, Rebecca knelt in front of Emily. "I know I hurt you, my daughter. There's no excuse for that. I just hope you can forgive me one day." Emily looked at her mother, the pain still evident, but something inside her was beginning to shift. "You left me alone, but you did it because you loved me. I think I can understand that now." Rebecca hugged her again, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, my little one. Thank you for being so strong." By the end of the day, the new family sat around a table at a small town restaurant, sharing a simple yet meaningful meal. Rebecca watched Emily and Henry, still trying to believe it was all real. Emily smiled more now, as if some of the weight she had been carrying had finally lifted. Henry, for his part, felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging. It was just the beginning of their journey as a family, but they all knew that together they could face whatever came next. The past had left scars, but the reunion was a chance to start anew, and they were ready to embrace that opportunity with everything they had. The day after their reunion seemed to bring a different atmosphere. There was a sense of lightness, a promise that the past, no matter how painful, was beginning to lose its weight. For the first time, Henry, Rebecca, and Emily were together as a family, even if they didn't yet know how to define it. Returning to the city marked the start of a new chapter. Henry decided that Rebecca and Emily would stay at his house temporarily until they found a more permanent solution. Rebecca, initially hesitant, accepted when she realized Henry was genuinely committed to change. Emily adapted quickly. For her, every small gesture, having her own room, her own bed, and the presence of her mother and Henry, felt like a dream coming true. But even amidst the happiness, the scars of the past remained, and everyone understood it would take time for those wounds to heal. "I'll take her to school," Henry told Rebecca one morning, referring to Emily. "It's time for her to start having the childhood she deserves." Rebecca smiled, touched. "Thank you for all of this." "We still have a lot of work ahead," he replied, "but it's the least I can do." Gradually, Henry began taking on an active role as a father. He accompanied Emily to her first classes, helped her with homework, and even ventured into bedtime stories. Rebecca, in turn, started lowering her emotional walls, allowing herself to trust Henry and accept his help. As the new family grew stronger, Matthew faced the consequences of his actions. With the evidence gathered by Lauren and the legal measures taken against him, his attempts at retaliation were completely neutralized. "He won't be a problem anymore," Lauren assured Henry. Rebecca, hearing this, sighed with relief. For the first time in years, there was no longer the shadow of Matthew looming over her life. She allowed herself to relax, knowing that Emily was finally safe. Henry, meanwhile, decided to make significant changes in his life. He delegated more responsibilities in his company, dedicating more time to Rebecca and Emily. He realized that the meetings and contracts that once seemed indispensable now occupied a secondary place in his life. "What made you change so much?" Rebecca asked one night. "Emily," he replied without hesitation. "She showed me what really matters." Months later, the new family was gathered in their garden. It was a simple scene, yet full of meaning. Henry and Emily working on a puzzle together while Rebecca tended to nearby flowers. Emily looked at her mother and then at Henry. "We're a real family now, aren't we?" she asked with a smile. Rebecca paused for a moment, wiping away a tear that insisted on falling. "Yes, my love. Now we are." Henry stood up, walking over to both of them and placing his hands on their shoulders. "And this is just the beginning." The future wasn't perfect, but it was full of possibilities. Henry, once a cold and distant man, was now someone who found joy in simple moments with his daughter and Rebecca. Rebecca, in turn, was rediscovering the courage to trust and love. And Emily, for the first time, felt the security of belonging to a family, something she had always dreamed of, but never had. The final scene was a reflection of this transformation. Under the setting sun, the three laughed together, their voices filling the air with the promise of better days. After all, love, no matter how late it arrives, is always capable of healing the deepest wounds. And this new family was determined to build a future full of hope, together. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.